Hi everyone. This video covers Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, written in 1651. It is one of the most important works in political philosophy, and this website here gives us three chapters, chapters 13, 14, and 15. Chapter 13 may be the most famous of all the chapters, the most commonly read. I'm just going to be covering the highlights here and giving you brief explanations. There's a lot more in this book. The language is difficult. It drops us off here right into chapter 13. What's he been doing before this in the book? He's been laying his foundation, putting out his philosophy, talking about his empiricism, his epistemology, his nominalism, and his materialism, or his metaphysics. And now he's going to give us his view of human nature here in chapter 13, which is not very optimistic. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to read a lot, but hopefully give you some good explanations as well. So, first sentence, nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind. He says, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest. So, by nature, we are physically equal, we are mentally equal, and we can destroy one another if we want to. He says, from this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope in attaining our ends. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in the way to their end, which is principally their own conservation, and sometimes their delectation only, or pleasure only, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So they are equal in physical abilities and mental abilities, and they want the same thing, and there are limited resources. So what are they going to do in that state of nature, this pre-civilization? They're going to destroy one another. This is basically humanity fighting it out in the woods. It's kind of like an episode of The Walking Dead, if you like that show. So, skipping down, he says, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, or to make them afraid, they are in the condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man. He continues, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto, during all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. So again, not a pleasant place to live outside of society without any sort of, as he calls, common power to threaten punishment, to threaten law and order. It's everybody against everybody, and it's an ugly place to live. Everybody's afraid. Nobody wants to live this way. And his famous line here, in this state of nature, or in this time of war, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So again, a very dismal picture of human nature, of human society, this is pre-society, pre-civilization, without any laws. It's not a pretty picture. Okay, skipping down, let's go to, he says, to this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, there have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. He continues, but only that to be every man's that he can get, and for so long as he can keep it. So again, everybody's out for everybody else's stuff, and he puts it in this language. Everybody has a right to everybody else's stuff, because there is nobody has ownership or property rights. So if you can take it, it's yours, basically. And so everybody's out to get what they can. And he says this really interesting statement here. He says these notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, there have no place. Now, it's easy to get confused about what he's claiming here. If you're thinking philosophically, you might be thinking he's denying ethics. He's denying objective moral values. But that's not exactly, commentators don't think he's actually doing that. He does seem to have some idea of natural law working in the background here. But he does say things that are provocative like this. And what I think he means here is that without civilization, without any enforcer, we can't say there is any type of justice or injustice. There's no right or wrong because there's no enforcement of right or wrong. So basically what he's denying is anything that's legally binding, absent any sort of legal or criminal justice institution. That's all he's saying, I believe. And so he says, and reason suggesteth convenient articles of peace upon which men may be drawn to agreement. These articles are they which otherwise are called the laws of nature. And so what he's saying here at the end of chapter 13 is that outside of any sort of common society, out of any sort of civilization, it's war. It's a state of war, a state that we don't want to live in, and we realize that. And in order just to preserve ourselves so we don't get killed, we see by reason that we ought to join into some sort of agreement with other people and surrender some of our rights to them. This agreement is called the social contract. This is the basis for government in his eyes. So let's go ahead and move on to chapter 14. Of the first and second natural laws and of contracts. He says the right of nature, which writers commonly call jus natural, is the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature. So what do we mean by liberty? Next paragraph. By liberty is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments. So we're not talking about some sort of metaphysical internal free will. We're talking about political freedom here to do what you want without any coercion. A law of nature, lex naturalis, is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life. So law of nature, rights of nature, liberties, all of these things serve as the foundation for his idea of the social contract. The law of nature, interestingly, is something accessible by reason, and I think what he means here is something that is found in deep nature, we might say, in the divine reality, in God, and there's lots about God, he has to say, in the Leviathan. He continues, and consequently it is a precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace. So, thinking carefully about life, we realize we have an obligation to seek peace, and he says, from this fundamental law of nature by which men are commanded to endeavor peace is derived the second law, that a man be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary to lay down this right to all things. So, joining together in this agreement, following this rule of reason in order to get peace, we join in agreement with others, forming a social contract in order to keep the peace. But to do that, we have to lay down some of our own rights that we had in the state of nature to get along. He says, if a covenant be made wherein neither of the parties perform presently but trust one another in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man, upon any reasonable suspicion it is void. But if there be a common power set over them both, with right and force sufficient to compel performance, it is not void. So we have this agreement now, but the agreement itself is void unless there's this so-called common power, this threatening force that will tell us that we will be punished unless we keep to our agreements, or to our covenants. And so this is the idea of the Leviathan. The Leviathan, the name of the book, refers to this political authority or this power that coerces us to keep our promises, to keep our agreements. And that's going to come up later. I think it's in chapter 17. We're not going to read, but he's going to, the next few chapters, set up the picture to lead into this idea of this Leviathan. Okay, just a few things from chapter 15. He says the definition of injustice is no other than the not performance of covenant, and whatsoever is not unjust is just. So again, this notion of justice only makes sense, he thinks, when there's something legally binding. That means you've entered into an agreement, which he's talked about, I've skipped over in chapter 14, what a contract is, what a covenant is. I went ahead and skipped over that, but an act of injustice only occurs when you fail to fulfill your part of the bargain. He says, before the names of just and unjust can have place, There must be some coercive power to compel men equally to the performance of their covenant, and we learn later that that is what he calls the Leviathan, or the political authority. Okay, there's a lot more there, but I hope I've pulled out the main points, and I hope that helps you better understand what Thomas Hobbes has to say in the Leviathan.